Page 105, number 3. The Seminar on Hamlet, quote, Desire and the Interpretation of Desire in Hamlet, unquote, reprinted in Literature and Psychoanalysis, The Question of Reading, Cologne, otherwise, Shoshana, Shona, Fellman, ed., Johns Hopkins University Press, 1982, pages 11 to 52, para. Lacan's own explication of his ideas is often intimidatingly obscure. I would suggest that in reading him you should devote some study time to reading the same piece several times rather than reading through a great deal of his work once only. In grappling with Lacan, I have found the following particularly helpful. Para 1. David Lodge's brief summary of the argument of Lacan's, quote, the insistence of the letter in the unconscious, unquote, pages 79-80 in Modern Criticism and Theory. Page 106, number 2. John Lechter's account of Lacan's thinking, chapter 2, quote, the effect of the unconscious, unquote, in his book Julia Kristeva, pages 13 to 64. I have also drawn upon this for the biographical details given above. 3. A summary by Toril Moy, pages 99 to 101 in Sexual/Textual Politics, Mithuen, 1985. 4. The Critic of Lacan, chapter 5, quote, the mirror stage, a critical reflection, unquote, pages 131 to 163 in Raymond Tallis's Not Saussure, Cologne, a critic of post-Saussurean literary theory, Macmillan, 1988, para. The most important Lacanian text for literary students is, quote, the insistence of the letter, unquote, first delivered in 1957 to a lay audience of philosophy students rather than to trainee psychiatrists, but using material from the professional seminars. In what follows, I attempt a summary of the argument, trying to show why these ideas have been used so intensively by literary critics. Para. Lacan begins the piece by paying allegiance to the intellectual dominance of language studies. He asks rhetorically, quote, how could a psychoanalyst of today not realize that his realm of truth is in fact the word, ? Unquote. Language then is central, and this is so because in investigating the unconscious, the analyst is always both using and examining language. In effect, Freudian psychiatry is entirely a verbal science, and the unconscious is not a chaotic mass of disparate material as might formerly have been thought, but an orderly network as complex as the structure of a language. Quote, what the psychoanalytic experience discovers in the unconscious is the whole structure of language, unquote, para. So the unconscious in Lacan's famous slogan is structured like a language. But how is a language structured? Modern language studies, he goes on, begin with Saussure, who shows that meaning in language is a matter of contrasts between words and other words, not between words and things. Meaning, that is to say, is a network of differences. There is a perpetual barrier between signifier, the word, and signified, the referent, refrent. He demonstrates this built-in separation with a diagram showing two identical lavatory doors, one headed ladies and the other gentlemen. This purports to show that the same signifier may have different signifieds, so that, Lodge, page 86, quote, only the correlations between signifier and signified supply the standard for all research into meaning, unquote. Hence, quote, we are forced to accept the notion of an incessant sliding, page 107, of the signified under the signifier, unquote, Lodge, page 87. That is, words and meanings have a life of their own and constantly override and obscure the supposed simplicities and clarity of external reality. If signifiers relate only to one another, then language is detached from external reality and becomes an independent realm, a crucial notion in post-structuralist thinking. See Chapter 3, pages 61-62. Para. But what evidence is there that the unconscious is linguistic in structure as Lacan alleges? He argues that the two, quote, dream work, unquote, mechanisms identified by Freud, condensation and displacement, this chapter, pages 94-95, correspond to the basic poles of language identified by the linguist Roman Jakobson, that is, to metaphor and metonymy, metonymy, respectively. The correspondence is that 1. In metonymy, one thing represents another by means of the part standing for the whole. So 20 sail, S-A-I-L, would mean 20 ships. In Freudian dream interpretation, an element in a dream might stand for something else by displacement. So, a person might be represented by one of their attributes. For instance, a lover who is Italian might be represented in a dream by, let's say, an Alfa Romeo car. Lacan says this is the same as metonymy, the part standing for the whole. 2. In condensation, several things might be compressed into one symbol, just as a metaphor like, quote, the ship plowed the waves, unquote, condenses into a single item two different images, the ship cutting through the sea and the plow cutting through the soil. Para. The use by the unconscious of these linguistic means of self-expression is part of Lacan's evidence for the claim that the unconscious is structured like a language. He goes on to emphasize the linguistic aspect of Freud's work. Whenever the unconscious is being discussed, the amount of linguistic analysis increases, since puns, P-U-N-S, allusions, and other kind of word play are often the mechanisms which make manifest the content of the unconscious. Think back to the aliquots example, for instance. Para. The transition section of the essay moves attention again from the conscious self, which has always been regarded as the primary self, to the unconscious as, quote, the kernel of our being, unquote, stop. In Western philosophy, the conscious mind has long been regarded as the essence of selfhood, page 108. This view is encapsulated in the proclamation by the philosopher Descartes, D-E-S-C-A-R-T-E-S, quote, I think, therefore I am, unquote. Lacan lays down a dramatic challenge to this philosophical consensus. Remember that he is addressing an audience of philosophy students when he reverses this into, quote, I am where I think not, Lodge, page 97, that is, in the unconscious where my true selfhood lies. Lacan insists then that the Freudian discovery of the unconscious be followed through to its logical conclusion, which is, quote, the self's radical eccentricity, EX-centricity to itself, unquote, Lodge, page 101. And he asks, quote, who is this other to whom I am more attached than to myself, since at the heart of my assent to my own identity, it is still he who wakes me. Question, unquote, Lodge, page 102. Hence the self is deconstructed, shown to be merely a linguistic effect, not an essential entity. The unconscious, then, is the kernel of our being, but the unconscious is like a language, and language exists as a structure before the individual enters into it. Hence, the liberal humanist notion of unique individual selfhood is deconstructed. The argument, then, is extremely ambitious and wide-ranging in its effects. In a few pages, Lacan seeks to alter nothing less than our deepest notions of what we are. Para. But why in particular is it of such interest to literary critics? I think the answer to this question is a consequence of the relentless logic of the views put forward in the essay. Quote, thus, Lacan says that the unconscious is the, quote, kernel of our being, unquote, comma, but since the unconscious is linguistic, comma, and language is a system already complete and in existence before we enter into it, comma, then it follows that the notion of a unique, separate self is deconstructed. If this is so, the idea of character, which rests in turn on the notion of a unique, separate self, becomes untenable. So a major consequence of accepting the Lacanian position would be to reject the conventional view of characterization in literature. Since Lacan deconstructs the idea of the subject as a stable amalgam of consciousness, we can hardly accept novelistic characters as people, but must hold them in abeyance, comma, as it were, and see them as assemblages of signifiers clustering round a proper name. Hence, a wholly different reading strategy is demanded. Para. Further, the view of language offered by Lacan sees it as fundamentally detached from any referent in the world. Accepting this view leads to a rejection of literary realism, since in realist novels the underlying assumption is that the text figures forth the real world for us. Page 109. Hence, adopting the Lacanian outlook would involve valuing instead the modernist or postmodernist experimental, fragmented, elusive text where, for instance, a novel plays with the devices of the novel, alludes to other novels, and so on, just as for Saussure, the signifiers which make up a language refers only to one another and interact with one another, but do not figure forth a world. Hence, a wholly different set of literary preferences is also demanded. Para. Lacan's foregrounding of the unconscious leads him to speculate about the mechanism whereby we emerge into consciousness. Before the sense of self emerges, the young child exists in a realm which Lacan calls the imaginary, I capital, in which there is no distinction between self and other, O capital, and there is a kind of idealized identification with the mother. Then, between 6 months and 18 months comes what he calls the mirror stage, when the child sees its own reflection in the mirror and begins to conceive of itself as a unified being, separate from the rest of the world. At this stage, the child enters into the language system, essentially a system which is concerned with lack and separation, crucial Lacanian concepts, since language names what is not present and substitutes a linguistic sign for it. This stage also marks the beginning of socialization with its prohibitions and restraints associated with the figure of the father. The new order which the child now enters is called by Lacan the symbolic. This distinction between the imaginary and the symbolic has been used extensively in literary studies, for instance, by French feminist critics. See Chapter 6, page 124. In terms of the literary polarization between the realist and the anti-realist text, the symbolic realm would have to be seen as the one found in realist literature, a world of patriarchal order and logic. By contrast, the anti-realist text represents the realm of the imaginary, a world in which language gestures beyond itself, beyond logic and grammar, rather in the way that poetic language often does. Indeed, the contrast between the imaginary and the symbolic might be seen as analogous to that between poetry and prose. In practice, the two realms and the two kinds of language must always coexist, and the critical stance which follows from an acceptance of the Lacanian outlook will involve a preference for the kind of literary text in which there are constant eruptions, irruptions, of the imaginary into the symbolic, as in the kind of metafiction or magic realism in which the novel undercuts and queries its own realism. Page 110. A fine example of this kind of work would be that of the British novelist B.S. Johnson, whose constant textual inventiveness takes the form, for instance, of moments when the characters cross-question the author, taking issue with his version of their motives or his handling of the plots in which they figure. Hence, apparently abstract Lacanian notions such as the constructedness and instability of the subject (the self), or the subject as a linguistic construct, or language as a self-contained universe of discourse, can be seen in action in the texture of the work of fiction. Section: What Lacanian critics do. 1. Like Freudian critics, they pay close attention to unconscious motives and feelings, but instead of excavating for those of the authors or characters, they search out those of the text itself, uncovering contradictory undercurrents of meaning which lie like a subconscious beneath the conscious of the text. This is another way of defining the process of deconstruction. 2. They demonstrate the presence in the literary work of Lacanian psychoanalytic symptoms or phases, such as the mirror stage or the sovereignty of the unconscious. 3. They treat the literary text in terms of a series of broader Lacanian orientations towards such concepts as lack or desire, for instance. 4. They see the literary text as an enactment or demonstration of Lacanian views about language and the unconscious, particularly the endemic elusiveness of the signified and the centrality of the unconscious. In practice, this results in favoring the anti-realist text, which challenges the conventions of literary representation. Section: Lacanian criticism and example. Para. To illustrate some of the concerns of a Lacanian approach to literature, we can now look briefly at Lacan's well-known interpretation of Edgar Allan Poe's pioneering detective story, The Purloined letter, unquote. Parenthesis, the tale is included in the Penguin Edgar Allan Poe Selected Writings, edited David Galloway, and also reprinted in the Purloined Poe, parenthesis closes. Page 111. Lacan analyzed this story in a series of seminars as part of the induction process for trainee analysts. In the 1980s, several post-structuralist essays were written in response to the publication of these seminars, and much of the material has usefully been collected and republished in the Purloined Poe. Also, Newton's Theory into Practice contains an essay on the topic by the Lacanian psychoanalytic critic Shoshana Fellman. Since it is by Lacan himself, this example demonstrates the fourth of the Lacanian critical activities listed above, Lacan finding in it evidence of his own views on language and on the process of psychoanalysis. Para. Poe's story has about it an archetypal air which lends itself well to psychoanalytic interpretation. There is no in-depth characterization, the characters being suggestive of chess pieces which are moved about by the author in a ritualistic combat of bluff, counter-bluff, and subterfuge. They are named the Queen, the King, the Minister, the Chief of Police, and Dupin, D-U-P-I-N, the Detective. What happens can be divided into 4 phases. 1. The minister is in discussion with the Queen in her apartments when the King enters unexpectedly. He notices that she is anxious the King should not see a letter which is on the desk. But she can't conceal it, as this would draw his attention to it. When the attention of both is distracted, the minister removes it, substituting a letter from his own pocket which has a similar appearance. 2. When she discovers the theft, the Queen realizes who is responsible, and when the minister is away, she gets the Chief of Police and his men to search his apartments. In spite of employing the most thorough and scientific methods, they find nothing. 3. In desperation, she asks for Dupin's help. He visits the minister and reasons that carrying the letter on his person would be too great a risk, but its usefulness lies in his being able to produce it at any time, so it can't be hidden outside the house. But if it had been hidden inside the house, the search would have discovered it, so it must be in the house but not hidden. Sure enough, he sees the letter above the mantelpiece, carelessly pushed in amongst other items of correspondence. 4. He visits again and, having arranged a distraction in the street, substitutes a fake letter for it. The letter is returned to the Queen, page 112, and the minister, unaware that he no longer possesses it, brings about his own downfall. A note inside the fake reveals that this is Dupin's revenge for being duped by the minister in a love affair in earlier life. Para. Lacan's account of the tale is lengthy but of markedly different character from the conventional Freudian criticism of Poe, which is best represented by the work of Freud's 1930s disciple Marie Bonaparte, also extracted in the purloined Poe. In Bonaparte, the tale is read, as are all Poe's works, as a symptom of the author's neurotic inner life. Thus, she reads beyond the text to the author, identifying in him a mother fixation and necrophilia on the basis of the content of the tales. Lacan, by contrast, does not talk about the psychology of the individual author, but sees the text as a metaphor which throws light upon aspects of the unconscious, on the nature of psychoanalysis, and on aspects of language. We can summarize these as follows. 1. The stolen letter is an emblem of the unconscious itself. In the story, we find out nothing about the content of the letter. We merely see it affecting the actions of every person in the tale. Likewise, the content of the unconscious is, by definition, unknowable, but everything we do is affected by it. We can guess at the nature of this content by observing its effects, just as we can deduce the general nature of the letter's contents from the anxiety it generates. Freud's investigation resulted in confident assertions about the precise nature of the content of the unconscious, but Lacan is much more skeptical about the possibility of such certainties. Like the letter, the pieces which might make sense of our inner mental universe have been purloined, and we have to learn to operate without them. We have, that is, to use the code without having the key. 2. Dupin's investigation of the crime of the stolen letter enacts the process of psychoanalysis. The analyst in psychoanalysis uses repetition and substitution in getting the patient to verbalize painful repressed memories. The original event is repeated in verbal form, but the verbal account is then substituted in the conscious mind for the repressed memory in the unconscious. Once it is conscious and verbalized, the memory is disempowered and, page 113, mental well-being is restored. Likewise, Dupin's investigative process in the story centers on repetition and substitution. His theft of the letter from the minister is a repetition of the minister's theft of it from the Queen, and the theft in both cases is achieved by substitution, a false letter being used as a replacement for the real one. 3. The letter with the unknown content is an embodiment of aspects of the nature of language. In language, there is an endless play of signifiers, but no simple connection with any signified content beyond language. The signified is always lost or purloined. In the same way, we see the significance of the letter throughout the story, but we never find out precisely what is signified within it. It is an example of signification itself, not a sign of some specific thing. Likewise, all words are purloined letters. We can never open them and view their content unambiguously. We have the signifiers, which are the verbal envelopes of concepts, so to speak, but these envelopes cannot be unsealed so that the signifieds will always remain hidden, just like the content of the purloined letter in Poe's tale. Para. Comparing the Freudian and Lacanian examples discussed in this chapter will make it immediately apparent that there is an immense gulf between these two approaches, even though paradoxically they both stem from the same original body of Freudian theory. Section Selected Reading. General. Ellman, Ellmann, Maud, MAUD, Psychoanalytic Literary Criticism, Longman, 1994. A useful collection showing the influence of Freud and Lacan on criticism. Feldman, Shoshona, ed. Literature and Psychoanalysis, The Question of Reading Otherwise. Johns Hopkins University Press, 1982. An important collection of essays, Feldman's own, quote, Turning the Screw of Interpretation, unquote, is about Henry James's story, quote, The Turn of the Screw, unquote, one of the earliest texts to be subjected to psychoanalytic criticism by the critic Edmund Wilson in 1934. Jefferson, Anne, and Roby, David, edited Modern Literary Theory, A Comparative Introduction. Batsford, 2nd edition, 1986. Chapter 5, Modern Psychoanalytic Criticism. A useful general account not restricted to Freud. Kurzweil, Edith, ed. Literature and Psychoanalysis, Columbia University Press, 1983. A very useful collection with good editorial commentary. The first section is on early psychoanalytic theory, the third on literary applications, including essays on Keats on Henry James's disturbing ghost story, quote, The Jolly Corner, unquote, on Kafka, and on Louis Carroll. The final section is on French psychoanalytic theory. Weiss, W-I-A-C, Inge, I-N-G-E, and Mills, Maggie, and editors, Psychoanalytic Ideas and Shakespeare, Karnak Books, 2006, a book which links the Bard's universe to psychoanalytic thought and practice. Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, Elizabeth, Psychoanalytic Criticism, Theory in Practice, Polity Press, Revised Edition, 1998. Short and wide-ranging dealing with Freudian and Lacanian approaches as well as others not discussed here, but not an easy read. Next section, Freud. Bernheimer, Bernheimer, Charles, and Kahane, Kahane, Claire, in Dora's Case, Freud, Hysteria and Feminism. Columbia University Press, 2nd edition, 1990. A critic of Freud's handling of this case by various commentators, including Jacques, Jacques, Lacan, briefly and incisively, Jacques in Rose, Toril Moy, and Jean Gallop. This book works beyond the traditional but now outmoded antagonism between feminism and psychoanalysis by moving towards Lacanian and post-structuralist rereadings of Freud. Freud, Sigmund, The Interpretation of Dreams, first published in 1900, Volume 4 in the Penguin Freud, a key work in the creation of 20th century sensibility, explains the basic dream mechanism, condensation, VI, that is Roman 6a, displacement 6b, also the Oedipus complex and Hamlet, pages 363 to 368. Freud, Sigmund, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, first published in 1901, Volume 5 in the Penguin Freud. Very readable and interesting in spite of the title. Either this book or the case histories would be the best place to begin with Freud. Freud, Sigmund, Case Histories 1, Dora and Little Hans, Volume 8 in the Penguin Freud. Detailed records of Freudian interpretation. The element of ingenuity and complexity emphasized above is very evident in these accounts. Thurschwell, Thurschwell, Pamela, Sigmund Freud, Routledge 2000. A useful title in the Critical Thinkers series, which is similar in introductory scope to the old Fontana Modern Masters series. Page 115. Timpanaro, Timpanaro, Sebastiano, The Freudian Slip, SLIP, Psychoanalysis and Textual Criticism, Verso paperback 1985. I list this fascinating and readable book by a noted Italian Marxist partly because it is illustrative of the traditional antagonism between Marxism and psychoanalysis. Timpanaro deconstructs many of the slips in Freud's psychopathology on the grounds that they are explicable in terms of incidental verbal similarities. See, for instance, his discussion on the aliquis example, pages 19 to 28. Wollheim, Richard, Freud, Fontana Press, 2nd edition, 1991. Still the best introduction, but read some of Freud himself first. Lacan, Homer, Scan, Jacques Lacan, Routledge Critical Thinkers 2005, a useful title in a useful series. Lacan, Jacques, Desire and the Interpretation of Desire in Hamlet, reprinted in Literature and Psychoanalysis. The Question of Reading Otherwise, ed. Shoshana Fellman, Johns Hopkins University Press, 1982, pages 11 to 52. Lacan, Jacques, The Insistence of the Letter in the Unconscious, reprinted in Modern Criticism and Theory, edited David Lodge, Longman, 1988, pages 79 to 106. Lacan, Jacques, Seminar on the Purloined Letter, reprinted in The Purloined Poe, Lacan, Derrida and Psychoanalytic Reading, edited by John P. Mueller and William J. Richardson, Johns Hopkins University Press, 1988, pages 28 to 54, with extensive editorial commentary and annotations. Lacan, Jacques, Eccrits, E-C-R-I-T-S, Eccrits, Routledge 2001, a very welcome publication in Routledge's excellent Classics series, which reprints key critical texts of the 20th century. Michel, Juliet, and Rose Jacqueline, editors, Feminine Sexuality, Jacques Lacan and the École Freudienne, Freudine, Macmillan, 1982. Key Lacanian texts translated and discussed. Rabate, Jean-Michel, ed. The Cambridge Companion in Lacan, Cambridge Companions to Literature, 2003. More advanced material for the study of Lacan's ideas. Sarup Madan, Jacques Lacan, Harvester, 1992, a volume in the Modern Cultural Theories series by an able explainer of difficult material, begins with an account of Freudian ideas and ends with a discussion of Lacan and feminism. Page 116, Chapter 6, Feminist Criticism.